Right. So for everyone watching on the live stream, we are starting in 4 minutes. So you still have time to grab a coffee or grab a tea or something to drink or move or stretch. And I'm letting in people now. So just we can say hello to all these lovely people coming into the session. Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Wonderful to see some faces. Feel free to put your camera on. It's much nicer to connect to actual faces than to letters on black background. Beautiful. Welcome, Isti. Welcome, April. Hello, Kathy. Hello, New Direction. What a beautiful name. Hello, Marina. Hello, Jen. So if you want, and that's something we will ask probably in pretty every session, it would be wonderful if you could rename yourself with the location where you are. Because as you know, embodiment happens in context. It's like David is in Bali, I'm in the Netherlands. So we have a very different context in which we're acting and meeting on Zoom. So it helps us to get a little bit of feedback where you are and what you are up to. So that would be lovely. Marina from France, hello. Bonjour. That's pretty much all I speak in French, I'm sorry, but it sounds really lovely. Hello, Bibi. Hello, Lisa from Sydney. It must be late for you already. No, not so late. Bibi is from Norway. Hello, Rosa from Finland. Wonderful. So we have 2 more minutes and yeah, get prepared for the session, whatever you need in order to be comfortable. So I'm always recommending to get something to drink, but if you can, maybe also get a cat to cuddle. Helps tremendously when you're working with trauma. So everyone should have a cuddle cat somewhere around. Hey, Steve. It's good to see you. Good day, to say it in Aussie. Right. And just make you co-host, so in case you can help out and jump in. Steve is actually the magical wizard behind this event. He puts together almost everything, just jumping in and helping out.
With Daniela did some cool stuff too, so it's both of us. Good day, David. Nice to see you.
Hey, Steve, you too.
And for those who are just jumping in, it would be lovely if you could put your camera on. It also gives us a little bit of feedback on how things land, and it's nicer for the teacher. But especially talking about trauma, it helps a lot to see how things land, because that can be sometimes a sensible topic. But before I'm starting to talk a lot about like safety measures and so on, let me start the recording and start the session officially. All right, where's the recording button? There it is. So welcome everyone to this week, Hidden Trauma, Trauma Summit. And it's lovely to have you here for the second session together with David Treleaven. My name is Daniela and I'll be hosting and teching for the session. So if you have any problems, issues with the tech, please message me privately and I will help you. If you have purchased the all access plan, that means you're in the Zoom room. It would be lovely if you could turn your cameras on, as it gives us valuable feedback. And it doesn't matter if you're like walking your dog or cooking, or as long as it's not something inappropriate, obviously up for your own interpretation. It just provides us helpful feedback. If you're on the stream, don't worry about the camera because it's one stream only. All right. So if you are interested or if you like this, please do share these sessions or the information about the event with your friends. It's going on the whole week, so it would be lovely to get more people knowing about this work because it's really essential. And we will talk a little bit more about like following offers and courses at the end. A few safety things before we're starting. So talking about trauma can bring up our own personal trauma. So really important, notice if you're resourced enough right now. So if you're well enough to drive a car, or if you, then it's fine. But if you have like, I'm not feeling so well, maybe it's better to watch the recording. Good question is always, is it kind to yourself to watch that now? Also remember, it's education, not therapy. So we will educate, but it's not designed for people who are currently in the worst kind of trauma or experiencing a lot of trauma symptoms. Then therapy is probably better served here. Also super important, because we're just at the beginning, do not binge. Trauma content is not something to binge, but take it like in small sized bites. That's why the sessions are only 30 minutes. If you feel like you're getting tense up, remember you can move, you can breathe, stretch, move, remember to breathe, maybe put your hands on the belly, and remember you can always watch later. And having said all of this, this can be also a lot of fun. So we do recommend for these sessions movement, good company, if possible nature. So if you're outside, that's great. Or after the session. And with that, do let me introduce our speaker. And I'm always saying I have a little bit of a fangirl crush on David Treleaven. Really love his work. And David is a trauma-sensitive mindfulness educator. He's a writer and a trauma professional, the author of Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, Practices for Safe and Transformative Healing, highly recommended. He also offers workshops on trauma-sensitive mindfulness at the UCLA, the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts, and the Omega Institute. He's currently a visiting scholar at Brown University and generally just a beautiful and kind human being. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Daniela. Thanks for the intro. And thanks also, Steve, for you holding it here. It's good to be connected with both of you. And thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm always moved to get to be in a group whenever people came purposely to talk about trauma. Just Danielle, as you were saying, the intentionality of, appreciate all the setups that you made here, and just the willingness in this particular historical moment to really turn and face the worst kind of stress that we can experience as humans. It's no small thing. It's a really big deal. And so I love, Daniela, that we're doing these in the 30-minute sessions. I think that's a great idea. And just glad that you're all here. And so the main goal of this session is, there's two main things I'm wanting you to leave with. One would be an understanding of why meditation can create some challenge or difficulty when it comes to traumatic stress. And then second is ways to recognize trauma inside of yourself or in clients. It could be students or clients and people that you're working with. So my experience of this work, it's a lot about just knowing and understanding and kind of consciousness raising. And that's about 50% of the whole task here. So I think we can get a lot done inside of this 30 minutes. Just want to invite you, as we begin, why don't we just do a very brief practice here, just for less than a minute. Just invite us to pause together, as we're wading into this topic. So if you'd like, you could take a couple of deeper breaths. You're welcome to have your eyes open or closed, but just taking a moment to pause and notice how you're arriving to this session, whether you're live here with us or on the recording. Just recognizing what's here. Could be your mood, like how you're coming to the session emotionally, sensations that are predominant or more offline, or it could be thoughts and narratives that are here. And just as much as possible, recognizing what's here and allowing it to be here. Just there's some basic agreement with the present. And then invite you to take another breath or two here. Maybe feeling the contact points with the ground, the buttocks in the chair, the feet on the ground. And then we'll begin here in earnest. Great, thanks everyone. So as Daniela said, my work really for the last 15 years now has been looking at the very particular relationship between trauma and meditation. And I imagine many of you will have a practice here of some kind, whether it's a formal meditation practice or an embodiment practice of any kind. But really, I'm working with anyone who is paying close and sustained attention to the body. Now, typically, I'm working with meditation teachers, some yoga teachers, and also, coaches or therapists who are offering mindfulness-based interventions in their work. And the main headline up front here is that asking someone, as you all know, asking anyone to pay close attention to their bodies or their inner world in a sustained way is a really big deal. For those of you that might remember the first time you practiced meditation, it's a very powerful practice to engage in. And it's an especially big deal when it comes to trauma. That's really the headline of this whole session. And by trauma, I realize you'll have a whole week here around engaging with trauma. What I mean is the most intense form of stress that we can experience. We're all experiencing stress. Can be good, can be bad. Not all stress is bad. Someone says, I love you, or we get a job that we wanted. We can experience stress. And then we have traumatic stress. And this is really a threat to life and limb. It's really where our survival is on the line. Common definition is a form of stress that involves a threat to our physical safety, and so it's experiencing this level of survival-based threat that we're in here, and that's different from the everyday difficulty or stress that we can experience. We have a whole conversation about this, and I hope you do this week, about the ways that trauma is being talked about in increasingly kind of like with a wide lens, meaning like, wow, that traffic jam was really traumatic or something like that. It's not to put down the stress of a traffic jam, but really with trauma, we're in the deep end. We're in some of the most intense form of stress we experience. So let me explain why very briefly, which is the title of this session here. Why would meditation end up being difficult for someone who's experiencing trauma? And then we'll talk about how to recognize trauma, and if we have time, maybe even like one practice here. So the easiest way to explain this has to do with the myth of Medusa. And most of you will know this myth. So we have Medusa, this very powerful creature who has this superpower that anyone who looks into Medusa's eyes, they'll freeze and they'll turn to stones. Medusa is often cast as having snakes in their hair. I know that Medusa is often cast as female. This is not gendered. I don't mean this is a gendered conversation. If we could remove gender for this for the moment, there's some strong critiques of Medusa, but it's a very helpful myth. Okay, so we have Medusa. There's a person named Peter Levine who is the creator of something known as somatic experiencing. Somatic experiencing is one of the most popular psychotherapeutic approaches to trauma recovery. It's I'm not getting any money from him or anything. It's just a lot of people take this training. The headline of somatic experiencing is that whenever we're working with trauma, we don't necessarily go right at trauma. So we wouldn't ask a client, for example, who's starting to talk about their trauma, to pay more attention to the sensations that are connected to the trauma, or maybe the thoughts or the flashbacks. There's an element of exposure and paying attention to trauma in therapeutic work, But if we go too quickly towards focusing on trauma, that can overwhelm the nervous system. That's basically the punchline here. And the tie into Medusa is that Levine said trauma is a lot like working with Medusa. So when we experience trauma, especially if we're experiencing something known as post-traumatic stress, where the trauma is ongoing, we'll have a number of different symptoms. We could have, as you'll hear about all this week, or many of you will know, we'll have things like intrusive thoughts or intrusive sensations. We might feel frozen. We might feel deeply agitated or hypervigilant. So all these different symptoms that can happen when we're experiencing trauma. And what Levine noticed is if you ask someone, or if we ourselves pay too much attention to these symptoms, that can be too much for our nervous system. We basically become convinced that the trauma is happening again. You ever had the experience where, there's something really intense happening, or you have a level of fear or agitation, and focusing on the sensations or the experience of the fear actually doubles it down. It tightens things up. This is the idea here. But when it comes to trauma, it can really ratchet up our nervous system to the degree that we end up feeling highly dysregulated, potentially dissociated, and re-traumatized even. Okay, so given that, I want you to imagine for a moment the potential setup inside of meditation when it comes to trauma. Some of you might have experienced this yourself, but if you haven't, let me just pace you through this for a moment. So imagine that you are someone who's experienced trauma. Let's tie it in right now to the pandemic. Let's say that you had a loss, a significant loss during the pandemic, or maybe there was a form of anticipatory grief, high levels of stress that ends up being traumatic for you. And then imagine you said, I've heard a lot of good things about meditation. Let me go to fill in the blank. I'm going to go to this Zoom group that's working with meditation. I'm going to get this meditation app because I heard that meditation will help with stress. Trauma seems to be a form of stress. So therefore, let me meditate. Let me work with this. Imagine, let's say it's a Zoom group, okay? You come into the group and you're asked through the instruction to basically pay close attention to your experience in the present moment. So you close your eyes, bring your attention inward. And what you find there is a racing heart. Yeah, something, again, let's say it's connected to your trauma. And then the instruction is, well, just pay attention to the breath. And just bring your attention whenever you're distracted, just gently come back to the breath, like a puppy, bringing it back. It's a great instruction, but as you can imagine, when it comes to that level of activation inside of us, we're going to naturally and reflexively orient our attention to the racing heart. It's like we're reading that as a potential threat. Something's wrong, something's dangerous. So I'm going to bring my attention there. So you're in class, you're trying your best, and you keep paying attention to the racing heart. This is upping your anxiety, but you're there and it's like you're desperate. You want some healing, you want some relief. So doing the best you can, you keep trying to bring your attention back to the breath. Your attention keeps going back to the racing heart. You end up frustrated. It becomes a really difficult practice. You leave the meditation group feeling dysregulated, a little overwhelmed, and you end up feeling kind of ashamed. Like, damn it, I brought the best of intentions and I can't even seem to meditate. So those are the people that I've ended up working with for the last number of years, who come to meditation with, honestly, the best of intentions, and then end up feeling dysregulated, overwhelmed, and sometimes even re-traumatized, like it made things worse. And this gets back to Medusa. Yeah. So basically, they're focusing their attention into the present moment, to their inner world. They're encountering Medusa in some ways, traumatic stimuli. And then they don't have the tools to be able to work with this in the present moment. And that's really the headline of all the work that I'm up to, is this thing called trauma sensitive or trauma informed mindfulness. It's like, well, what would you need to know in order to meditate effectively? The people who tend to run into trouble don't have tools. And the one thing I love about this community, when Daniela asked me to be here, is I imagine many of you will be coming here to this session with a whole lot of tools at your back, that you have been cultivating over time. And there's some people who come into practice who kind of white knuckle grip their way through it, and they just come back to this basic instruction of being present, which is helpful until it's not. So it's like mindfulness can be very helpful for trauma. It brings us to the present moment. It helps us have more connection to our bodies. And more is not always better when it comes to mindfulness and meditation. We need to have some tools. So that's basic. That's basic. One of the things I wanted to communicate here with all of you. There's a potential pitfall around meditation when it comes to trauma. And we can start to equip ourselves with some different tools. One way you could think about this actually is shields. In that myth of Medusa, Perseus goes to Athena, goddess of knowledge, and basically says, what do I do? And Athena says, you need a shield. If you're going to go into the cave with Medusa, you need to have a shield to reflect Medusa's gaze. So what are shields that you can have in your life, in your practice, for yourself, for other people that you're working with? And we're not going to have time to get into all the different tools and shields and practices. But the primary one that I want to offer you here is around recognizing trauma. This common question, well, how would I know in meditation if I'm at a level of traumatic stress where I might end up, where I should back off of practice? Because I'm not saying that if you're experiencing trauma, you should never meditate. On the contrary, it can be very useful. But there might hit a moment if you're experiencing trauma where more attention is not going to help. So how would you know? So the first thing is being able to recognize symptoms of trauma. So let me talk through a little bit, and then we'll finish with a brief practice here, like kind of here's what you can do. So the easiest way that I've found when working with people, some of you might be trained as trauma professionals, deep bow to your work here. For those of us that aren't trained, I was trained a trauma professional, but if you're not, here's one way you could think about it. There's something known as the window of tolerance. Many of you might have heard about this. This comes from Dan Siegel. It's this idea that there is a sweet spot or a window between too much and too little, and we can apply this to our nervous system. So the window is literally an optimal zone of physiological arousal. It's like a place where our heart is beating, but it's not racing. We feel alive and alert, but we don't feel hypervigilant and anxious. Doesn't mean we can't be sad. We can have different emotions here, but it's really a zone where we can be present and tolerate our experience. On the top, we might have what's called hyperarousal, too much arousal. We're hypervigilant, we're sweating, our pupils are dilated. And on the bottom, we have hypoarousal, where we're frozen, we feel stuck, we feel numb. Let's just take a moment here, just invite you to just notice where you are in your window right now. Just taking a moment to see where you would plot yourself if you were on a graph. Would you say that you're in your window of tolerance right now? Or maybe you're towards that top zone of hypervigilance? Or maybe towards the bottom, like you're feeling a bit frozen or hypo-aroused. See if you can just notice without judgment. And then also see if you can notice what told you that that's where you are in your window right now. That's where this becomes a mindfulness practice, is that awareness, that ability to just notice where we are in a given moment. Okay, so that's where you are in your window right now, wherever you are. That's great. If you need to get a glass of water, if you find yourself totally out of your window and you need a break, of course, go take care of yourself. What's important here is that traumatic stress will tend to push us outside of our window of tolerance. It creates something known as dysregulated arousal, which is really where our nervous system is out of whack. This will not be a surprise to any of you who are interested in trauma and the fact that you're here. The easiest way I found to think about this is thinking about our autonomic nervous system as having an accelerator and a brake. all throughout the day, all the time, our accelerator and our brake are actually in coordination with each other. So this is our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. Ideally they're coordinating. We get up in the morning, we need a little bit more energy. We have more sympathetic arousal. We back off, we're sleeping, we have more parasympathetic arousal. So those are fluctuating all the time. When it comes to trauma, it's often like both of these pedals are slammed to the ground. You can imagine what that would feel like for someone experiencing trauma. So the accelerator slammed to the ground is often talked about as fight flight. A lot of energy in the body. We're in the top of the window of arousal, or we're outside of it. The brake is more of a freeze. Yeah, that's where we feel stuck, we feel numb, we feel dissociated. And traumatic stress can have us feel like both of these pedals are slammed to the ground. It's a hugely uncomfortable, profoundly dysregulating, and painful experience. It messes us up in relationship. It makes life really difficult. And the way to recognize symptoms of trauma, one way, and one helpful way in meditation, is signs that you're outside of your window of tolerance, that you basically have too much accelerator or too little brake. So intuitively, I'll give you some data points here, but intuitively, that's what I'd say about how can you recognize trauma in your practice or in your day-to-day. Yeah. On the top, we have, what does it feel like when you have too much physiological arousal? We're sweating, we're hypervigilant, we have an exaggerated startle response, we feel highly agitated. It's when we're in the red, in that zone. Or alternately, what does it feel like for you when you're hypo-aroused, or there's an incredible amount of parasympathetic activation in the nervous system? You might feel frozen, numb, checked out, dissociated, foggy, absent. There's disorganized cognitive processing. So that's what you can start to look for. And what's really interesting, and then we'll move towards a practice, what's really interesting is that at the end of the day, this is less about definitions of trauma. I mean, it's important to have this conversation, I think, socially, for us to talk about, well, what do we mean by trauma? How do we want to define that? There's a way that it's getting watered down, I think, in some ways. What do we want to define? What are the boundaries of trauma? It's an important conversation. And for the conversation that we're having here, what we're actually focusing on are nervous systems. And how do we work with regulated and dysregulated nervous systems inside of meditation? That's the idea. So just to sum up what I've covered here in the session, if you or someone that you know or you're working with has experienced trauma, meditation may or may not be helpful. So I talked about Medusa. If someone is meditating, there's a good chance they're going to hyper-focus on Medusa, keep bringing their attention there, which can leave them feeling overwhelmed. So then what can you do? Well, you can actually learn to recognize trauma in practice, whether you're working with people or just working with yourself. And then you can develop these tools or different shields that you can have. So let's do one very briefly. This is going to be just a 2-minute practice here. And then Danielle, I'll turn it over to you. We're going to work here with a couple different anchors of attention. So many of us were trained to work with the breath, but for people who are traumatized, the breath won't always be neutral. Yeah, if we're paying attention to the breath, we might connect with that racing heart, or as we talked about with hyperarousal, that agitation or that hypervigilance. So it's useful to have a couple different anchors of attention that we can work with to cultivate mindfulness. I just invite you to drop your attention inside for the present moment. Again, we'll just be here for a minute. And the first anchor I invite you to work with are sensations that are not connected to the breath. So that might be the sensations of the feet touching the floor, or the buttocks in the chair, or the hands gently pressed together or in your lap. It can be any number of things. And just let this momentarily be your anchor. Meaning that if you find yourself distracted or lost in thought, you'll just gently bring your attention back to this anchor. It's a way to cultivate some mental stability, some mindfulness. The second anchor is to work with sound. I invite you to, for a moment, let hearing or sound, if that's available to you, be your anchor. If sound's unavailable, you could use sight or touch. Otherwise, bringing attention to your soundscape. This can also work as an anchor. It's going to be different from sensations, but still can be very useful. And then finally, bringing your attention to your breath. Could be sensations at the nostrils, the rising and falling of the abdomen or the chest. And just letting this be your anchor for a moment. And then notice, if we were to do a longer meditation here, which anchor would you choose to work with? Is there one that feels easiest for you? Would help you cultivate mindfulness? Or perhaps it's an anchor external to you. But just note that for yourself. Which is the anchor you'd use here? And then in the next few breaths, I'll invite you to shift back here, taking your time. Okay, so that was just a really brief practice on what you could call a trauma sensitive or a trauma informed practice. It's basically saying, well, how could we practice meditation, which is very useful and powerful, if we were experiencing trauma or our nervous systems were highly dysregulated? That's one way that we could do it. So really this work goes off in that direction, but I'm hoping that today just gave you a sense of the terrain around why meditation can be difficult for people who are traumatized, and then ways that you can recognize trauma symptoms. So Daniela, I feel like I just started. We blink and it's over. So I'm going to say thank you and ask you, turn it back over to you, and thank everyone for being here. And what do you want to add, or how do you want to wrap us up?
Thank you so much. I love your sessions. So if you like the sessions as well, I would invite you for the last minute or two to write in the chat or write down for you one or two things you're taking away from this session. In order to wrap a session up and really learn, reflection is essential. So take a minute or two to write down what you're taking away from the session. Further on, I'd like to invite you, because we're just in the beginning of the event, to share this event with anyone who would benefit from that. Maybe take a moment, stop and pause and think who would like to thank you if you share this link to the event. And we have the all access pass, but we have also the option to just join for free for 3 sessions, which anyone can pick. The replay of these sessions will be available and will be emailed to you. So if you want to watch the recording later on, just look out for an email. If you have any further questions regarding courses and so on, please mail our support, our beautiful Agatha, who will help you with anything. And just to give you a little bit of an idea what's coming up, especially if you liked this session, do let me share our schedule. So we have a lot of things coming up. We're just here at Monday, 10 o'clock, at least for me. So there is a lot of like special things on how to recognize trauma, how to work with trauma, how trauma manifests on different occasions. If you really like this session, let me scroll quickly through and point you to one session which might be particularly interesting, which is here on Thursday at 7 o'clock British time. where Mel and Karen talked about a traumatized person's guide to sitting calmly with yourself, trauma and meditation. So we're going a little bit deeper into this topic, but check out the schedule. There are plenty of other things available for you.
Daniela?
Yes.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, David. I tuned into David's while I was having my lunch because I didn't want to miss it. I knew it'd be great, and it's always solid. So thank you so much, David. David, I just have one question. If Daniela meditates on a picture of you with like flowers around the outside, with like lights around it on a little shrine, is that okay?
I don't know if I feel totally comfortable with that.
I'm a bit uncomfortable with that.
I'd love to.
You really don't need to answer this question.
I'm just teasing Daniela. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. I'm on with Erica shortly about conflict, and it's going to be fun. So I'll see people in a bit. Cheers.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you to David. Thank you to Steve and to Mark. And hope to see you in the next session with Mark and Erica on how trauma controls your fight-flight response, trauma and conflict. Thank you so much and have a lovely rest of the day.